giving you a voice,
making it loud our own way.
Welcome to the fun.
Want to be our boss? Tell us what we're worth and have a say in how our shows are ran? Visit our Patreon to pledge your support at patreon.com/funfrc.
All right, so we're going to get right into things. We're going to kick everything off, and we're going to cover tonight's favorite topic, which would be districts. We have a very interesting mix here, as you know, Brandon's part of New England as well as myself. Adrian, you're part of the Texas district. Welcome to District Land. And Corsetto, no one knows if California will ever go to district. So we have a really interesting mix of people here. So let's start out by talking about what's worked with districts so far and what hasn't. And anybody can jump in here, but I think, Brandon, you're going to be best to start off with this. So what's your take on districts, and where can there be improvement to provide teams a better experience?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we've heard this debate a bunch. I'll try to put some different insights into it and a few different takes. I mean, I think districts overall are a great thing. I know there's people that feel counter to that. I'm always up to hear why people think that. But for me, and for my team and for a lot of the teams our team works with, getting out on the field, competing, that's just such a big, moment for the team each season. And being able to only do that, less than 10 times or something, and your season being over, it's hard to say that's actually, pushing inspiration to where we want it to. And especially when you compare it to a district event or district system where a team can go out and compete a bunch of times. It's much more like a sporting event, a sporting team, which is how a lot of people relate to a competition and how first can really get through there. So, overall, I love districts. Experience-wise, though, I mean, I think there's huge room for improvement. Obviously, my take's going to be very New England-centric, but, I'm pretty connected and looking around, and I see a lot of what the rest of the community is doing. And I think there's a lot that every district can really work on and try to get that experience even better. There's things that are really hard for district teams. One example is qualifying for championship super late in the season. And it puts a lot of stress on those teams. So I think districts can do a lot better job trying to manage that type of stuff. They could do a lot better job of growing volunteers and, actually developing systems for people to kind of grow inside FRC. So, I think there's definitely a lot of room there. Overall, I think it's a great thing. I'm glad to see Texas and Adrian coming on board this year. You guys will have your hands full for sure, but I hope eventually everybody has a chance to get involved in districts.
Yeah. So, Adrian, so moving into districts with Texas, like how are things kind of shaping up in Texas? I know in New England, we have it kind of structured a certain way where like we have a nonprofit that oversees New England first as a district, and there's, regional directors, there's, a board that oversees the nonprofit itself. So how has Texas kind of prepared itself to transition into the district model?
Yeah, so we kind of have a similar system. So First in Texas is the kind of governing nonprofit behind all of this. But for at least this year, we have one person that's employed with First in Texas who is in charge of like all events. And so he has been working to secure venues, do all that stuff. And I've been working with him. Greenville is on the docket right now to host a district, which should be exciting. But, I'm not sure how that'll change in the future. But at least for the first year, that's, we're kind of just going to have one main contact for all the district events. And they actually just released like a preliminary schedule. And so since we are a Houston championship, obviously, we have to have our district championship in week 6 so that we can go to champs week 8. And so we only have 5 weeks of competition. And so we have 2 set up every weekend, I think. And they're pretty spread out like every week, you'll have like one in Dallas and one in Houston, or one in El Paso and one in San Antonio or something like that. So it seems like they have things, kind of rolling. But I'm sure there's a lot of things that we're going to have to figure out as we go.
Yeah. So with 148 specifically, this past year, you guys only played 2 regionals for the first time since 2015. So are you guys looking forward to potentially playing more than 2 events? Obviously, more than 2 events, you're going to get your 2, and then more than likely your district championship. But are you looking to do more than that? I know it's a tight schedule with only 5 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a tight schedule with 5 weeks. And we've actually been talking about that a little bit, especially because right now the Greenville district is set to be week 4, which really kind of like throws a loop in scheduling, because we're kind of debating right now whether we want to compete in our own district, and the overwhelming probably response from the team is no. So we're going to see if we can get our home regional, I guess, to be somewhere else, like maybe swap with a different team that's also hosting an event or something like that. But so if we're hosting a district week 4 and we're not competing week 4, that puts a lot of restrictions on our schedule, because if we decide to go to state championship, which we're the only team in Texas that I guess can kind of make that decision. So we're a little unique since we're pre-qualified.
Oh, yeah. Original.
Yeah, original and sustaining. I think, I don't know why we wouldn't go to state championship. Especially since in Texas, our state championship is actually coupled with the UIL state championship. That's like our governing body for sports. And that's a really big deal in Texas. In fact, the Robo Wranglers are the only team in our school to have won a UIL state championship.
Wow.
And so I can't imagine we wouldn't go to it. Unless something crazy happens. So it puts a little damper on the schedule. And I think the thing that is most depressing about that is, especially with champs in Houston, like we probably won't travel outside of Texas. And so that's one of the biggest downsides for me. I think in the kids right now too, they're pretty upset. But I think just with the schedule the way it is, it's going to be really hard for us to travel anywhere.
Yeah.
I think we would want to if we could, but.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting point. So I know, 125 is definitely one of the few teams in New England that has, traveled outside of our district to a regional, and pretty consistently in the last few years. So it'll be interesting to see what teams in the Texas district start doing that, especially, you made the point that you're not going to really be competing outside of the state. So another question that I have for you, and Mike and Brendan, feel free to jump in on this, but what is your take on New Mexico joining the Texas district?
I mean, it's 8 teams. I think it's hard for me to kind of like have an opinion. It's 8 teams. I mean, and I guess they wouldn't have anywhere to go, but I feel like it's a little odd considering there are a lot of states that border us that are probably in that same position. And so I don't really know, why New Mexico was the one that was coming in. But I mean, the more the merrier. I don't expect to see a whole lot of them this year, just because with only 8 of them, and there's a whole lot of competitions that are a lot closer that we probably wouldn't travel to. I think in Texas, districts are so weird because like we can drive 12 hours to go to a district where most district teams do not have that situation.
No.
But yeah, I mean, it is what it is.
Yeah.
I'm interested to see how that affects other districts, and I'm interested to see how that affects other teams in the same position that are not in New Mexico.
Yeah.
So
it's pretty interesting. Like, I think there's very few states and areas where you can, travel that far and then still be in the same state. Like, at least within our district, Maine is really that only state. And there's only one district event in Maine. And all of these teams drive, at least 4 or 5 hours to each event. And I'm sure California is the same way, right? Like a lot of teams will travel, insane distances and stay with.
I was pretty happy to see Texas kind of bump the like state boundary thing. I know it's going to be harder in some situations, but this is like, it's really hard to draw a district line. When you do it by state lines, it can really cut off whole sections, and first grew outside of state lines. So like now you go in and you cut it back up, and it becomes really hard. So I like that Texas is looking at that and doing that. Hopefully it encourages other districts in the future to break outside of just state boundaries. When New England is a unique one because we are multi-state. But yeah, I thought it was a good move. Though it's hard. There's some areas that do get cut off that weren't part of that.
Yeah, I think it echoes a bigger problem too, where first is such a FRC is such a resource intensive competition that New Mexico never had a regional, right? I mean, they had 8 teams and no regional, and they were coming, I assume, to El Paso to compete for the most part. And so I think it's a good decision from that perspective of reacting to what the geography looked like as far as the FRC landscape, and saying these teams typically compete in Texas and only Texas because it's their best option. So let's put them into this camp of Texas districts. So it makes sense from that regard. But I think it also just highlights another odd thing about FRC, where you can't just start a little FRC competition in your hometown and start up 15 teams in that town at like your local schools and then start and have a competition. I mean, it's not that scale of event. It's a much bigger scale, and it doesn't scale up as nicely as even VEX EDR or FTC. It doesn't scale up as nicely as those competitions because of the huge cost barrier and resource barrier to starting an FRC team. And so it puts first in some tricky spots with how to best serve some of their more remote teams, because they are so separated from anyone else that's even competing in the same league as them. It's pretty unique in that regard. So it just highlights that. But I think kudos to everybody involved with making that decision. Hopefully it serves the New Mexico teams well. But I think it's a nature of this competition we're all part of. It's so resource intensive that teams can end up being a little stranded.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like when New England first went to districts, it was one of the very few regions that went to districts, and we kind of left New York high and dry. Like, we had teams from New York that were constantly coming to our events, and vice versa. We were going to their events, and now we still have teams going to their events, but they're kind of blocked off. And at first I was like, well, why didn't we just include New York? Or like, why can't there just be like a common point system throughout every single district? But now as they're growing, it's like, it's becoming more and more difficult to figure out how to integrate that stuff later on down the road, since each district is really doing their model differently. So I think with Texas keeping, an open mind to that, like you were saying, it's a wise idea, and it really could kind of open the door for New Mexico to really be able to grow their community a bit more.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of interested to see, is what happens to New Mexico by being part of this district. Are they, I know with schools, out of state trips are kind of difficult. And so now, obviously they didn't have an in-state trip to go on anyway. But is that, when you're recruiting and you're trying to grow your area and trying to get teams, is the fact that all of your competitions are going to be in Texas, is that going to be an issue? Or is that going to just having, the district model available to them, is that going to just help them grow, even if it's in a different state? So, I mean, I think I'm going to, obviously a lot of people in Texas, I'm sure, are going to pay attention to that, but I'm interested to see kind of how that dynamic works, because obviously it's going to be different for that teams that are in Texas.
If I could say one more thing too, I think that might mirror the results from Michigan and the UP, where they had just a few teams, and those teams then had to drive twice down to the main part of Michigan to compete. But now there's, I think, multiple districts in the UP, and Michigan, the UP itself has many FRC teams now. And a part of that was what they were able to start a lower resource intensive district event in the UP, and that spawned additional accelerated growth. And obviously Michigan is an anomaly in a lot of ways, but maybe New Mexico might take a similar route, and you might see in 2020 a New Mexico district event for the Texas district that might spawn a little bit more growth in the region. I think we've seen it work with other remote areas in the past, and I'd be interested to see if it works in New Mexico as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So Adrian, quick question for you. So you had mentioned that your event in Greenville is going to be week 4, and you guys are pretty much saying a hard no right now to competing at your own district event. So 125 hosts a district event, and we've competed at it each year, even when we've said, maybe we're not going to. So what is your kind of logic behind that?
It's tough. So, without getting into too much detail about the geography of Texas, Greenville is about an hour and 15 minutes outside of Dallas. It's a pretty rural community, and we are basically like the last thing before you hit Arkansas. That's, kind of a bigger city. So Right now, just with our resources, I think that we're going to be pulling a lot of people from the team to be able to help with that district. And I think that trying to do that and have the team compete is going to be really difficult for us. We have really specific roles for all the kids and all the mentors. And I think when you start messing with that dynamic, that things get a little weird. So, when we were talking about it, it's like, okay, well, this is the first time we're going to districts. This is the first time we're hosting an FRC event at our school. We don't want to tax ourselves. So that's just kind of our thinking behind it. I mean, who knows? It's August. So who knows?
Who knows? Maybe you'll compete, week 1 and 2, and then by week 4, it'll be your 3rd place. So you just throw your backup drive team onto your
Adrian, is your shop going to be the practice field for the district event?
This is crazy. So the guy Chris, who is doing all this, he came to tour our school because I actually didn't even put in a bid. He was like, "We really need another district. Like, let me come and see if your school works." That's basically how we got roped into that. And nice. I was like, "Oh yeah, we wouldn't even have to build a practice field because we have a practice field." He was like, "Oh, we really want something like in the gym. We don't really want people like walking around the school." And I'm like, "But why?" We have this full field. Half the time our full field is better than, the real field because we make it so it can stay still. We don't have to make it movable.
Right.
And so I actually don't know. And I've kind of been questioning that as well.
Man, I hope that would be like the most epic inter-district play to go to. Like, I feel like you're definitely going to see some inter-district play at that district event, simply so people can go and like actually see the facilities that you guys have. So yeah, I know if we had the money and the time, we would definitely head out there.
Well, and let me look at this. I think that the week that we're hosting it, we're competing with somewhere. Oh yeah, the other district that week is in Del Rio, which again, without getting into too much Texas geography, is like way far away from anything else in Texas. So I think that there's probably not going to be a whole ton of Texas teams that want to go to Del Rio that weekend. It's kind of far away.
I think you guys are pretty spot on for being worried about how stressed your team's going to be. It's as the leader of the Neutrons, it's the thing I fear the most every year is our home district event. I'm also the event chair for that event, so there's extra wrinkles to that. But from a team perspective, it does really stress the teams out. It really stretches the team thin, and it really pushes you guys to a point where you've never been before. So I totally understand.
Yeah, and especially if you haven't had run an off-season event. Obviously doing like FTC or FLL or Bex tournaments are a whole nother beast, but, our team has been pretty experienced, at least with, not having Brandon around or, having to be stretched really thin. So if you don't have that experience, it can be incredibly stressful later on down the road.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing that we're worried about. I mean, like you said, we host tons of X events every year, but it is definitely a different animal. So we're nervous about that. Mm-hmm. I had something else I was going to say, but it just left me. So, oh well.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, like before we hop into our next topic, the optics of hosting an event and competing at it can be really tricky. And for us on the Neutrons, that's probably been one of the biggest stressors is the way that our students are kind of treated and viewed at the event. Like Brandon and I could probably run an FRC event in our sleep at this point, but just dealing with kind of the optics of things and being really cautious about how we interact with our team. Because let's face it, the reality is if you're chairing an event that your team is competing at, you're not going to completely, put up a brick wall. You still need to, be there and check in with your students every now and then. Like you're obviously not going to be drive coaching or, you're not going to be the mentor in the chairman's room, but you still need to give them some attention and, check in. And for some people that don't have an understanding of how an event is run or how things go, the optics can be really crappy. And for us, that's probably one of our biggest kind of blowbacks every year when we're doing that.
And we have those issues all the time at Vex events. I'll tell you, it's a real problem, especially if our volunteers come from Greenville, because that's where we are. And then of course we have all these Greenville teams competing. And so it's definitely a thing that we've experienced. So
the reason we choose to keep doing it is mostly I've never been to Greenville, but from what I've heard and seen, it definitely seems like a tight knit town. I bet a lot of people know who the Robo Wranglers are.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're in smack dab middle of Boston. It's hard for us to get attention, from people. So having an event at one of our schools where it's such a great opportunity to pull people in, and then we want them to look at our team. Everyone who walks in, they want to go, well, what's your team? What, like, oh, is that you guys out there? So that's why we continue to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I think the
That's a
benefit,
cool dynamic.
but it's very, very, tough to see the benefit sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. So moving on to our next topic, we're going to wrap up with looking at these areas who may not want to go to districts or may be adversely impacted by other areas going to districts. So Mike, states like California, New York, and Minnesota have been at the center of attention for these topics lately. So give us your take on California, and let's get everybody's take on the areas that might not want to see go to districts.
Man, so big topic. This has been a journey I've been on for maybe 4 or 5 years now, ever since districts really started piquing my attention. I started getting people together, talking about it a little bit more. A couple of years ago, I put out this big proposal that was just more of a creative writing project than anything else. At least that was the result of it. Didn't really measure up to much. We had a couple of first staff come out and talk to everybody in California about districts, but there weren't really any action items. Right now, and we're going to talk about the regional scheduling in a little bit, so I don't want to go into that, but we are starting to feel more of the pinch of other areas going to districts, and just looking at, or even in a place that's so big and has so many regionals like California, even Texas going to districts means that there's that many less regionals within possible driving distance of a couple days for your trailer that you can go to. And P&W has been off the table for us for 7 years now, 6 or 7 years. So it doesn't even feel like that was an option, but that used to be a place that a lot of teams in California went to compete. Even when I was in high school, I would go up to the, I think, what was it called? It was called the Pacific Northwest Regional at that point, and it would bounce between Washington and Oregon. And that was the only regional they had back in 2005, 2006, something like that. And that's where my team in high school from California used to go. And now we're starting to feel the pinch of other areas around us going to districts and us being kind of left out in the cold. And I'm interested to see what that does for our local leadership. And I think the hardest part about going to districts, and I think other people in areas like Minnesota and New York would probably say the same, advocates of districts would say the hardest part about being in this non-district area and wanting to go to districts is there is the one factor that kind of goes across all areas that haven't gone to districts yet is they don't have a strong local leadership to guide them there. And I think that's the thing that is in common between all the areas that have gone to districts is there was a group of people that stepped up, started a nonprofit like you were talking about earlier, Christine, and they made it happen. And I think that's the thing that we're lacking in areas like California and New York, and Minnesota has this kind of like black box regional planning committee that gets discussed a lot, and no one really knows who's on it and who's making the decisions. It's really weird. But that's really the common denominator for what's missing in areas like ours in California. And I know there's people trying to work towards that, and our RDs are really stepping up their efforts a little bit, but it's still, it feels like a day late, a dollar short a little bit. And that's really why we're stuck in where we're at right now. Whereas other areas have been on the offensive and they've really tried to make this district thing work for the betterment of their team. So that's how it feels right now, coming from an area that's still looking off into the distance, hoping for one days to get districts.
Well, what's tough for you guys is the mountain is getting steeper, right? Like as you're sitting there at the base of the mountain waiting to scale it, it's getting steeper because teams are still showing up and you still have more people. So like when you do flip that switch, you're going to go through what Adrian and them are going through right now, where you've got to go find, I don't even know how many it would be. Is it like 20 something district events you have to like materialize overnight?
Yeah, we're not at 20 yet, but we're getting there.
I mean, and so that's really hard. The volunteer base is hard. You know, even with all the off seasons and stuff that are popping up in California, that's a great start. I mean, New England, that was kind of how things started rolling here. Was we had so many off seasons, and they kind of became natural places to drop district events or consider, or at least to put a committee in place to try to figure one out. But the volunteer base, the event locations, it's only going to get harder the bigger the district gets. So
that was one of the things that was the most interesting about the Texas district to me, because it was the same way. Like a bunch of teams started having off seasons. It's like, okay, we're prepping for districts. Well, a lot of the teams that have hosted off seasons are not even district locations. I know, like I was talking to Alan Gregory from Spectrum, and they've been, on this train for a while. They've been having off seasons. They've hosted regionals now, and their school just told them, no, sorry, you can't do it anymore. I know like Conroe, where Texas Torque is, they have hosted a few off seasons, and they've done a regional. We went there a couple of years ago, and they're not on the list either. And so, it's interesting. It was interesting to me that, all these schools that it seemed like were kind of gunning to host district events after a few off seasons have kind of like fallen off the bandwagon. So I don't know what that says about the state of district locations as we move forward past this year, but
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like in New England, the places that we've had like off season and stuff, some of them have hosted district events, like we have at Northeastern, and like it's bounced around in Boston a bunch of times. But some, like, as being somebody that's been on a planning committee, all the like nitty gritty details that go behind it, and I'm sure you're noticing it now, Adrian, is like the insurance stuff, and like how much, like all these little things start adding up. It's like a high school is going to charge you a venue fee, and then they're going to require you to do X, Y, and Z. Like, the event that I was running before, they required a police detail. They required a nurse be on duty, like anytime that somebody was in the building. Like after the first year, they saw how much toilet paper we went through, so they added on all of these extra things afterwards. So like it sounds like it may seem weird that, some of these schools are like, we don't really want to host an official event here, or like, they're apprehensive about it, but, it's somewhat a liability for some schools maybe, or if it interferes with sports, which I'm sure in Texas, sports are life.
Yes.
In New England, not so much, because we're not very good at the sports. So, I mean, it's definitely like a very delicate balancing act. And in New England, we don't have these huge high schools. Like in Texas, I'm sure they're gigantic. And in Michigan, they're huge. In Indiana, they have a separate, gym just for basketball. And for New England, we're constantly looking for affordable venues that can actually host these teams, not just the field, but, give them a tiny, tiny practice space, or, like actually host more than 20 teams in a pit area. So in off season, one thing, but actually moving into the district event where you need to host like, upwards of 40 teams is a totally different ballgame. And we're smack dab in the middle of what, like basketball season and indoor track and stuff. So it's definitely an interesting thing to get into. And it's been interesting for me to see where district events happen at in different districts. Like Ontario has these like gorgeous universities, and I'm pretty jealous of them, but I'm interested to see how Texas goes. And for Mike, like it's interesting hearing you talk about how, like you don't have the people in place right now to like set up a nonprofit. But at the same time, I will say, to counter that, not having the people and not jumping in is a very good thing. Or, not having the right people in place, because if you dive in, you make it through your first year, and then you realize, oh man, like, if you don't have people that are actually like passionate and caring about, how can we expand? How can we grow? How can we, make more teams? How can we make more events and save more money so we can, grow these things? It's a train wreck. Like if you don't have the right thing set up and you just dive into it, there's really no going back after that. So as much as I want to see California go to districts, I guess you just have to quit your job and become a regional director in California. Like that's really the solution here. Take a bit of a pay cut for the benefit of California.
I have a question for you, Mike. Like when this group of people that you've talked to and work with, where's the resistance come from? Like, what do you hear back as the reason to not do it? Like, what's the barrier?
Well, okay, so I could approach that from a couple angles. I mean, the majority of it is just not responding and not really engaging. So that's easier to do, because most of the people in charge in your local areas don't really have any incentive to see districts happen. And so specifically regional directors haven't not really engaged much on this topic with me. But the normal thing is really the big three. Where's the money coming from? Where's volunteers coming from? And do we have the venues? And I really tried to address those as even-headedly as I could in the proposal that I put together a couple years back. But yeah, I mean, I would say that it's hard for me to really nail it down because there isn't much conversation going on. And if there's work happening, which I've heard maybe rumors about, it's definitely way behind the scenes. They're not even engaging anybody to ask them to help or to get started on groundbreaking on some things. So it's really hard to say where the resistance is at. It's more of just a overall black box. You don't really know what's going on. A lot of information's going in and nothing's coming out.
It's such a common theme I've heard, like from people that are, I've talked to people inside Minnesota that really want to push districts, and it's very common. What you're saying is that it's almost it's hard to get a conversation going. Like you can talk out, but there's nothing talking back, so it doesn't really go anywhere. So it's just interesting.
Yeah. You always hope that it changes, but there's nothing you can really do until it actually changes. So
yeah. And one big thing that I've noticed, at least from a district standpoint, is that if the leadership of a district are not engaging and utilizing their community members that are most passionate and most kind of like, the people on the ground that are, part of a team, part of a event or a volunteer, you're doing it wrong. The people that I feel are most successful, like the districts, are the people that are engaged with their community, like their teams, their volunteers, and they really utilize each kind of facet of that, the people that are passionate, and the whole screaming into a black box thing. Like I totally have been there in our district in New England, and it's frustrating. And I think that, hopefully over time, you'll see that California will kind of start cluing in on what's going on, if anything, behind the scenes. I really hope that California goes to districts at some point. It would be really cool to see more inter-district play in that part of the country, because there's not a lot of opportunity. I feel like for PNW, they're kind of stranded out there. And, for Minnesota, we have a mentor that joined the Neutrons this past year who's from Minnesota, and she was from a really small middle of nowhere team who only competed at one regional a year. So when she came to all of these districts this year with the kids, like what do we do? 3 districts, district champs, a regional, and then champs. She was like, it was like the best time of her life. She was having an absolute blast, and seeing that, rookie teams or like really low resource teams that could come in to their first event and be total crap, but leave that event because of the support that they got at that event from teams and volunteers, move on to another event and get better. Like that to me, like she was like, this is the best part of districts, is that there's room for growth with the kids and the teams. So hopefully we'll see more regions move on to that, in the future, so everybody can grow. So we have a lot of really great questions coming in from chat. The first one is from none other than Karthik. He wants to know, what are the group's thoughts on the possibility of expanding inter-district play to the point where you can earn points outside of your region and sign up for an outside event as your first or second sign up? I really like this question.
I'll go first. I think that for me, first, and like what it was when I was in high school, was it was this huge organization. You could meet people from all over the world and all over the place. The fact is that may be hard to continue with a move to districts. And as much as I'd love to see inter-district play, because our team loves seeing other teams and moving to other teams, unfortunately, districts run on local money and local support. So when that support goes into teams that aren't from the area, and that compromise has to be made, I think the first thing that's going to have to go will be that inter-district play, which is why I think we don't see it right now, which is why we don't see it in an official sense. We have the third plays that don't count for anything, but I don't know if we're going to ever get there. I'd love to, but I don't know if the equation will work out there.
Yeah, I think that seeing the amount of teams that are actually participating in interdistrict play is so low. And I think that I know at least in Texas, we're struggling for venues. And so thinking about opening it up to other places means basically you have to have more events so that everybody can, be able to play their 2 plays and then, allow for other people to come in. I just think just from my perspective right now and the kind of the planning stages of all this stuff, it just seems like it's just going to be really, really hard to implement, but it would be fun. I mean, that's how I spent my childhood in FRC, was traveling around, meeting new teams. But I don't know. I am kind of looking forward to going to districts and kind of just having to worry about our district until we get to world champs. So yeah. I just don't know if it's super feasible.
Yeah, I'd say just from a planning perspective, it's really hard to plan for whatever your influx might be in first and second registration. I think the only, maybe compromise I could see is if people getting into districts during open reg, they go inter-district, maybe those points do count towards their points total because they're playing earlier. But, even that just seems like it's pretty ineffective to maybe addressing it seems like the core of what you want from interdistrict play is like, I really want teams to start to mix between the different geographic regions. But really that's like the worst thing from a planning perspective is to have a ton of flow. So I think it's probably not going to happen or not happen soon. And if it does, it'll just be for those third registration. Maybe you still get points for what you do early on in the season, even if it's outside your district.
All right. So we're going to move on to our next question from Clint at FRC. So he wants to know, what's the minimum reasonable team count to start a district system? I think Indiana went with like 52 teams.
It seems like a good answer to me. I mean,
I couldn't even tell you how many teams Texas has right now. It's probably terrible.
Yeah, I would just say have enough districts to be able to reasonably host 3 events and then have your district championship. I mean, I think it worked for Indiana, and I think it actually added in a lot of energy towards Indiana as a whole. If you, I don't know, if you remember over the last couple of years, Indiana has actually gotten quite a bit of attention nationally, and I'm first wide, because I think the district model really helped promote their teams, because their teams are just playing more often. You see them breaking records or setting high scores for FRC on almost a yearly basis now, and it's because their teams just get so much play time. And I think, when you have 50 something teams and you can host 3 36 team district events, you're set. And then your teams get to play more. They get to play a DCMP with each other. And then they're going into champs playing 3 or 4 times. And it's a big deal for those teams.
I would agree with that. All right, and our last question right now is again from Karthik. So he wants to know, and I'm not going to let you guys explain why, but each of you are going to answer this question. So in what order do the following regions go to district? Minnesota, California, and New York. Adrian, we'll start with you.
Minnesota, California, and New York.
All right. Brandon, you're next.
I'm going to go California, New York, Minnesota.
Oh, and Mike?
I'm going to echo what Brandon said, because I think there will be a full-on strike in Minnesota before they go to districts.
Fair enough.